They came without warning, the way all real disasters do. Not with the trumpet blare of invasion films or the slow creep of diplomatic collapse. One morning the sky above Osaka simply cracked open, and through that crack poured something that had no name in any human language. The Veth. That was what the xenolinguists eventually called them, borrowing the closest phoneme from a fragment of their broadcast signal. A long, wet exhalation, like a sigh at the end of a sentence that had taken 1,000 years to speak. The Veth had been traveling that long. They said so themselves. In the precise stripped-down pidgin they assembled from our own radio transmissions in the first 72 hours of contact. They said many things in those 72 hours. Most of it was instruction. Marcus Cole had been drinking when the crack appeared. He was sitting in a hotel room in Kyoto, nursing a bottle of Suntory he hadn't paid for, watching a television he'd muted because the news anchor's voice reminded him too much of the briefings he used to sit through. Pentagon conference rooms, satellite imagery, body counts delivered in the same flat professional tone as crop projections. He had been good at war once. He had been good at believing in it. Neither of those things was true anymore, and the distance between who he had been and who he sat here being had become a kind of occupation, something he carried room to room, continent to continent, unable to set it down. The muted television went white. Then the feed cut to a camera pointed at the sky. Marcus Cole put down his glass very carefully and watched the end of the world begin. He had come to Japan 6 weeks earlier to consult on a defense contract, a new targeting system the Japanese Self-Defense Force was piloting. Something involving autonomous fire coordination that the consortium's lawyers had quietly assured him required someone with his particular resume. He had a resume like a scar map: 15 years of service, 4 theaters of war, a silver star he kept in a shoebox because hanging it on a wall felt like hanging a confession. He had accepted the contract because the alternative was another empty apartment and another muted television, and at least this way the emptiness had a per diem. He had planned to be home in 3 weeks. The Veth settled their primary vessel over Osaka Bay and issued their first directive within 6 hours. All human military units were to stand down. All weapons above a certain threshold of destructive yield were to be decommissioned and surrendered at coordinates the Veth would specify. The timeline for compliance was 14 days. The Veth did not threaten. They simply described what would happen if humans complied and what would happen if they did not, in the same unaffected cadence. It was, in its way, more frightening than any threat. A threat implied they considered you capable of meaningful resistance. The Veth's tone implied they were describing weather. 41 nations complied, 19 did not. 3 launched nuclear strikes that the Veth intercepted so effortlessly that the subsequent silence, no detonates, no retaliation, just the missiles simply ceasing to exist somewhere in the upper atmosphere, was somehow worse than any explosion could have been. Marcus Cole was still in Kyoto when the JSDF dissolved. He watched their tanks roll into designated surrender yards on his phone, live-streamed by someone's shaky hand, and a civic sense of historical duty. He watched the soldiers climb out and stand in rows, and he recognized the posture. He had stood like that himself once, in a different context, but the geometry of defeat was universal. He should have gone to the American embassy. He should have gotten on the evacuation flight. He did not do either of these things, and he has spent considerable time since trying to explain that failure to himself, and has arrived at an answer that satisfies him no more now than it did then. He didn't go because he didn't know what he would do when he got there. He didn't know what he was anymore without a war to walk toward, so he stayed. He met Hiroshi Nakamura on the 3rd week. Nakamura found him was more accurate. Marcus had moved from the hotel, couldn't afford it, or rather couldn't bring himself to use the consortium's card when the consortium had almost certainly ceased to exist, to a small room above a sake brewery on the eastern edge of the city. The brewery still operated. Its owner, an elderly woman named Sato-san, seemed to regard the alien occupation the way she regarded everything else, as a condition to be worked around, not surrendered to. She kept her hours. She kept her prices. She kept, Marcus noticed, a particular deliberate dignity in the way she moved through her own establishment, as if the quality of her attention to small things was a form of argument she was making to the universe. Nakamura came looking for Marcus specifically. He had served DF 7 years, specializing in electronic countermeasures. He was 34, compact, with a face that held its expressions with the same economy he seemed to apply to everything else. He knocked on Marcus's door at 6 in the morning, and when Marcus opened it, said, in careful English, I was told you know how to fight without wanting to. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Who told you that? People who watched you choose to stay. He let Nakamura in. He made tea badly. Nakamura drank it without comment. They talked for 4 hours, and by the end of it Marcus understood that Nakamura was not alone. That there were, scattered across the Kansai region, former JSDF personnel who had complied with the surrender on paper and had not complied in their hearts, and that they had been meeting in the back rooms of sake breweries and Buddhist temples and convenience stores. Quietly, without weapons, because weapons were the one thing the Veth monitored with something approaching actual attention. They're not watching everything, Nakamura said. They're watching weapons, they're watching organized formations. They watch for the signatures of what they recognize as threats, because they have fought other species before, and they know what a military looks like. What they have not accounted for. He paused, chose his next words with the care of someone who had been carrying them for a long time. What they have not accounted for is a people who were a military and have become something else. Marcus said nothing. He was thinking about the word adaptation. He trained with them for a month. Not with weapons, Nakamura had been clear about that. They trained in movement, in silence, in the use of terrain. Some of them had backgrounds in martial arts that went back further than their military service. And Marcus spent his first week being efficiently dismantled by a 58-year-old man named Ito who moved like water and seemed constitutionally incapable of losing his temper. Each time Marcus went down, Ito waited for him to rise and then offered the same small nod, not approval, exactly, acknowledgement. You fell, you got up, continue. Marcus had not been taught like this before. The American military had taught him to absorb skill through repetition and documentation. You learned the procedure. You drilled the procedure, you applied the procedure under simulated stress until it became reflex. There was a clean logic to it that he had always found comforting. What Ito and the others taught was different. Less a procedure than a conversation between your body and the situation it found itself in. Less about executing a plan, and more about remaining so fluent in the fundamentals that a plan could emerge from the moment rather than being imposed upon it. He struggled with this. He was not by disposition someone who trusted emergence. He was someone who had survived by having the plan, knowing the plan, executing the plan, while everything burned around him. The idea that you could walk into chaos with open hands and find what you needed there. It struck something in him that was neither comfort nor dismissal. It was more like recognition, like hearing a word in a language you didn't know you spoke. He went down a lot that first week. Ito kept nodding. By the third week, he was going down less. By the end of the month, he was occasionally not going down at all, and once, only once, in a session that had run 2 hours past dark, he caught Ito in a redirect that worked not because Marcus had planned it, but because the moment had opened and his body had moved into it. He felt it happen. The strange, fluid certainty of the right action arriving before the mind could frame it. Ito looked at him afterward with something different in his face. You stopped thinking, Ito said. Yes. Good, Ito said. Thinking is too slow. They were 43 people. Former soldiers, a handful of civilians who had been in combat sports, 2 former police officers, 1 structural engineer named Yuki, who had no formal combat training but who understood, as she explained in a flat matter-of-fact way, how buildings failed, which turned out to be considerably more useful than Marcus had initially appreciated. They had no weapons in the conventional sense. What they had instead was Yuki's understanding of load-bearing failure, Nakamura's decade of work in electronic countermeasures, and the collective knowledge of what it meant to have been trained in violence and then required to become something quieter. They were, Marcus thought sometimes, exactly the thing the Veth hadn't thought to watch for. The Veth administered the region through 6 interface stations, structures that looked, from a distance, like architectural models of geometries that Euclidean space wasn't supposed to contain. They pulsed with a low electromagnetic frequency that Nakamura's instruments could map but not replicate, processed compliance documentation, relayed directives from the main vessel, and monitored the designated surrender yards where decommissioned weapons sat in neat rows under a sky that had stopped feeling like it belonged to anyone. Marcus spent 3 weeks studying the station nearest Kyoto. He went alone, on foot, at different hours, eating from a convenience store bag, and looking like a foreigner who didn't know where he was going, which was a disguise that required almost no performance. He watched the Veth personnel, 3 or 4 at any given time, tall and dry and absolutely still in the way of things that had evolved in environments where stillness was survival. They moved when they needed to. They did not patrol in any pattern he could disrupt. They monitored what their instruments told them to monitor. They did not look at him. He was not a weapons signature. He was not a military formation. He was a man eating convenience store rice in the morning shadow of a temple wall. And to the Veth's instruments he was exactly as threatening as the sparrows. He brought this back to Nakamura, who spent 2 days with it, and then said, "They've reduced us to data, and they're only watching for the data that looks like what they already know. So we have to be something they don't know," Marcus said. "We have to be something they don't have a category for." He thought about the night the ninjas had come to the village. Except it wasn't ninjas. It was his own history, his own memories of a different kind of war in a different kind of country. Men in the dark moving without the signature of soldiers but with something older and more purposeful. And he thought about what Ito had said, about thinking being too slow. He thought about the structural engineer and her knowledge of how things came apart along their own hidden lines of stress. He thought about what 43 people could do if none of them looked like what the Veth were watching for. The plan, when it came together, was not elegant in any conventional military sense. Nakamura was unhappy with it for 3 days, arguing that it had too many points of individual decision-making, that too much depended on people responding correctly to conditions that couldn't be anticipated. Marcus listened to all of this carefully and then said, "That's the point. We're not building a procedure, we're building a conversation." Nakamura looked at him for a long time. "You've been spending too much time with Ito." "Yes," Marcus said. He was not apologizing. The night they moved, it rained. Not heavily, just the soft, persistent rain that the region wore in autumn like a second skin. The kind that made sounds strange and distances uncertain. Marcus had not planned for rain. He had not planned against it. He had simply noted, in the weeks of observation, that the Veth interface station's external monitoring seemed to perform at a fractionally lower resolution in precipitation. Not enough to matter against a drone or a vehicle, but enough to matter against a person moving with purpose and no electromagnetic footprint. He led the first group himself. 7 people, Ito, 2 of the former JSDF personnel, a police officer named Mori, who moved through the dark with a quietness that Marcus had come to understand was not training but disposition, and 2 people he would not have classified as soldiers by any prior framework he'd held. One was a marathon runner, who had, in the weeks of preparation, developed a capacity for sustained silent movement that bordered on the uncanny. The other was a retired schoolteacher named Ogawa who was 61 years old, had no combat background, and who Nakamura had initially vetoed for any operational role. Marcus had overruled this. "Why her?" Nakamura had asked. "Because she's been looking at the station every day for 2 months from her classroom window, and she knows its rhythms better than any of us. And because she's not afraid," Marcus said. "She should be afraid. She is afraid. She's doing it anyway. That's different." Ogawa moved with them through the rain. They reached the station's outer perimeter in 40 minutes. Marcus stopped them in the shadow of a temple outbuilding and waited. He was counting his own breathing. Beside him, Ito was doing the same thing, which Marcus knew because he had come, over weeks, to know the particular quality of Ito's stillness. There was nothing performative in it, no effort, just the complete occupation of the present moment, the body waiting without urgency for what would come next. The plan was not to destroy the station. Destruction would trigger the Veth's response protocols, and the Veth's response protocols were a category of problem that 43 humans with no weapons were not equipped to address. What Nakamura had identified after weeks of mapping the electromagnetic output was something more specific. The station's communication relay, the thread by which this node spoke to the main vessel and to the other stations. Not the station itself, just the thread. Yuki had explained how. Not dramatically, in the same flat matter-of-fact way she explained everything. The way a structural engineer explains a load-bearing calculation, not as something exciting, but as something that simply followed from the physics. A structure fails at its stress points. The Veth station was extraordinary technology. Its communication relay was, at the mechanical level, a connection between 2 points. Connections could be interrupted without being destroyed. They could be interrupted in ways that looked, to monitoring instruments, like environmental interference, rather than deliberate action. If they think it's weather, she had said, they'll wait for it to pass. She had also said, we have about 20 minutes before they reclassify it. Nakamura's team was at the relay point when Marcus's group reached the outer perimeter. He knew this because of the signal. Not a radio signal, nothing that would register. Just a particular pattern of the flashlight that the marathon runner, whose name was Takeshi, could read from a distance in the rain with a precision that had startled everyone who witnessed it in practice. 3 blinks, a pause, 2 blinks. Ready. Marcus looked at Ito. Ito nodded. The same nod. You fell, you got up, continue. Except now it was, we are here, we move. What happened in the next 18 minutes has been reconstructed from the accounts of people who were there. And the reconstructions are consistent in their facts and divergent in what they remember most clearly, which is itself a kind of truth about what it was like to be inside it. Mori remembered the sound of the rain, specifically the way it changed pitch as they moved through different micro-environments around the station's base. Takeshi remembered nothing but the forward motion, not as amnesia but as presence, the way total engagement swallows everything except itself. Ogawa, the retired schoolteacher, remembered looking at the Veth inside the station's transparent outer membrane, 2 of them, tall and absolutely still, and feeling something she described afterward, not as courage but as clarity. I understood, she said, that they had never thought about us at all. Not really. And that was the thing that was going to matter. Nakamura's team interrupted the relay at the 17-minute mark. The station's internal lighting shifted, a subtle color change that Marcus had been watching for, the Veth equivalent of a system flag. Not an alarm, an inquiry. The station's instruments were asking, is this weather? They had 3 minutes. Marcus moved. He was not thinking. He had stopped thinking, not out of some transcendent mental discipline, but simply because the moment had arrived and thinking was, as Ito had told him, too slow. He moved through the station's outer perimeter at the gap Yuki had identified, through the specific structural juncture that was a load-bearing weakness. Not a broken thing, but a permission. A place where the structure's own design created a space it hadn't meant to create. He moved through it the way water finds a level. He moved through it because he had spent a month learning to find those spaces and move through them without thinking. The others followed. What they placed inside was not a weapon. The Veth would have detected a weapon. It was technically a series of passive electromagnetic configurations, materials and arrangements that Nakamura had spent 3 weeks designing, none of which individually registered as anything the Veth monitored, but which together, once the relay was restored and the station's systems resumed normal operation, would introduce a persistent low-level interference into the station's communication, not blocking it, changing it, introducing noise at the frequency where the station's reports to the main vessel encoded the regional compliance status. It would, Nakamura had explained, make this station report that everything was fine. At a slightly wrong frequency, for a long time, the Veth were precise beings. They would eventually notice the discrepancy between this station's reports and observed reality. But precisely because they were precise beings, they would not interpret that discrepancy as a human action. They would interpret it as a malfunction. They would send a maintenance inquiry. They would wait for the inquiry to resolve. They were beings for whom patience was not a discipline, but a fact of their nature. They had been traveling for 1,000 years, and they were accustomed to things taking the time they needed. It would give the network of resistance groups, not just in Kansai, not just in Japan, a window. They were outside the perimeter and back into the rain in 4 minutes. They moved through the dark in silence, no one speaking, the rain continuing its soft erasure of footprints and sound. Marcus walked at the back. He was counting his breathing again. He was not, he realized, feeling what he had expected to feel. He had expected relief, or the particular adrenaline crash victory of the executed plan. What he felt instead was something quieter, something that did not have a military name. Ito fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a long moment. You didn't stop moving, Ito said finally. No. Even when you should have been uncertain, you didn't stop. There wasn't time to be uncertain. Ito considered this. That's one answer, he said. They were back in the brewery before dawn. Sato-san, who had been told nothing, and who had clearly worked out a great deal, was already heating water. She brought tea without comment and moved back to her work. And Marcus sat at the table in the back room with steam rising from the cup in front of him and let the silence settle. Nakamura came in 20 minutes later. He sat across from Marcus. He looked tired in the way of someone who has done a thing they couldn't do and has not yet recovered from the surprise of having done it. It's running, he said. Marcus nodded. We have maybe 3 weeks before they notice something's off. 3 weeks is enough if the other groups do what they said they'd do. If, Nakamura said. Not a complaint, just precision. Yes, Marcus agreed. If he thought about the cavalry charge. The image came from somewhere older than this room. A memory, or a half-memory, of a history he'd studied once, with the detached interest of someone reading about a world that no longer existed. The last charge. The horses in the open, the guns at the end of the field, the absolute certainty of the outcome written in the math of the moment. And the charge happening anyway. Not because victory was possible, because honor was. Because some things were done not because they worked, but because they said something that could not be unsaid. He was not Katsumoto. He was not charging into Gatling guns. He had in fact been extraordinarily careful not to charge into anything, to find the angles and the permissions and the gaps in what the Veth were watching, to be the thing they had no category for. And yet there was something in the oldest of those stories that he had carried without knowing he was carrying it. Not the dying, not the noble futility of the final gesture. Something earlier. The part where a man who had given up on the meaning of his own capacity for violence found, in a culture not his own, a reason to point that capacity at something worth pointing it at. The part where the meaning wasn't in the victory but in the quality of the resistance, in the specific human texture of refusing to be reduced to a data point in someone else's compliance report. He had been a soldier who had stopped believing in soldiers. He had come here empty and had been not filled, exactly, not restored, something more honest than either of those. He had been given back the question and found that he still had the willingness to sit with it. He drank his tea. Sato-san moved through her brewery with her particular deliberate attention to small things, and the argument she was making to the universe continued, steady and unhurried, as it always had. The weeks that followed were not what the old war films would have you believe. There was no montage, no rising music, no sense of momentum building toward a visible horizon. There was mostly waiting, and the specific discipline of people who have acted and must now hold themselves still while the consequences of their action move through the world at their own pace. Nakamura monitored the Veth's communication patterns with instruments so modest they could have been mistaken for amateur radio equipment, tracking the absence of the inquiry that would mean they'd been found out, the presence of the continued silence that meant the interference was working. 3 days in, a message reached them from Hiroshima. A former Navy electronic warfare specialist named Tanaka had used their approach, or arrived at something similar through independent routes, at the station on the western edge of the Kansai monitoring grid. 2 days after that, a message from a group in Sendai that Marcus had never made contact with, addressed to no one in particular, and distributed through channels that had taken on the character of the old partisan networks in old wars. Word passed through hands that did not know whose hands had passed it first. The Sendai group had taken a different approach entirely, working not through the stations but through the Veth's ground personnel, not in any confrontational way, but in the way of people who understand that information has a quality of its own, and that beings who had reduced a planet to compliance data were perhaps not accounting for what happened when you introduced small, irregular truths into the data stream. It was not, Marcus thought, how he would have designed a war, but then he had stopped designing wars. He was learning, slowly and imperfectly, and with an ongoing awareness of everything he didn't know, to design something else. Something that did not have a military name yet, because it was still being invented here, in the back rooms of sake breweries and temple outbuildings and convenience stores, by people who had been soldiers and had become, under the pressure of a particular historical moment, something the Veth had not thought to monitor. The window opened on the 22nd day. It opened because the interference in the Kyoto station's reporting, combined with the Sendai group's data disruption, and 3 similar operations in South Korea, and one in coastal China that Marcus learned about only afterward, had introduced enough noise into the Veth's regional compliance picture that their central vessel's analysis systems flagged the entire Kansai through Tohoku corridor as a zone of uncertain data quality. Not rebellion, not organized resistance, uncertain data quality, a calibration problem. The Veth pulled 2 of their 6 regional stations offline for what their transmissions indicated was a maintenance cycle. They reallocated monitoring resources. For approximately 6 hours, the coverage that had held the Japanese archipelago in an absolutely seamless condition of observation developed gaps. Nakamura saw it first. He came into the back room at 3 in the morning, with his instruments and his face holding something Marcus had not seen in it before. Not quite excitement, not quite fear. The space between them. 6 hours, Nakamura said. Starting when? Starting 4 hours ago. Marcus stared at him. You waited 2 hours to tell me. I needed to confirm it wasn't a trap. Marcus thought about this for 2 seconds. Fair, he said. They had prepared for something like this. Not this specifically, not 6 hours at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, but a window, a gap. The moment that Nakamura's interference was designed to create. The preparation had been careful and modest, because they had learned, all of them, to scale their intentions to what they actually had and what they actually knew, which was not the style of planning Marcus had come from, but which had produced, over these weeks, a quality of readiness that he had come to trust more than he trusted the old comprehensive plans. They had 2 hours left. He got everyone up. 42 people. Ogawa had developed a respiratory infection the week before and was recovering at her daughter's apartment, and had sent a message that she was sorry to miss it, which had produced in Marcus a feeling he couldn't entirely account for, something adjacent to the feeling of passing a flask around a campfire the night before something serious. 42 people in the rain, moving through a city that was asleep and would wake up to whatever this had been. They did not charge. They had no horses, no swords, no last gesture of beautiful futility to make. What they had was Yuki's structural knowledge applied to 3 specific secondary junctures in the VETH Regional Administration Network. Not the stations themselves, but the physical infrastructure the VETH had installed between them. The connective tissue of the occupation's data architecture. And Nakamura's configurations, and a schoolteacher's 2 months of watching from a classroom window, and 40 years of paying attention to the small things that made up the actual texture of a place. They moved through the wet dark in groups of 6 to 6 different sites, and they did what they had learned to do, which was find the gaps and move through them without thinking. No weapons, no explosions, no Hollywood moment of defiant declaration. Just 42 people in the rain, using what they knew, trusting what 2 months of learning had built in them, doing the thing that the VETH, in all their precision, in all their vast experience of subjugating species that had responded to subjugation, the way species responded to subjugation, had not thought to watch for. Marcus reached his site with 9 minutes to spare. He placed Nakamura's configurations. He moved out. He stood in the rain on a temple wall and looked at the sky, at the crack that had opened up there months ago, and that was still there, visible on clear days as a discoloration, a shimmer, the scar of the VETH's arrival. And he felt the thing he had been unable to name, since the night of the first operation, settle into something he could almost hold. He had not won. He understood that. The VETH were still in the sky. The main vessel was still in Osaka Bay. The world was still occupied and would be occupied when the sun came up, and for an unknown time beyond that. He had not saved anyone, not in any final sense. He had not charged into the guns and died heroically and given the last samurai their perfect blossom. What he had done was something smaller and stranger, and he thought, more true. He had found, in a world that had been stripped of the things he had organized his life around, something that his specific and damaged and particular self was for. He had been given back not his belief in war but something older than that, his belief in the human-sized act. The thing done not because it would work, but because the quality of the doing was itself an argument. He had become in these months something the VETH's instruments were not calibrated to detect. A man acting with full attention, in the specific place he stood, with the specific knowledge he had, for the specific small purpose that the specific small moment required. He had been taught this, not by the U.S. Army, by a 58-year-old man who had nodded at him every time he fell, and by a school teacher who had paid attention for 2 months from a classroom window, and by a brewery owner who kept her hours and her prices, and her particular deliberate dignity as a form of argument she made to the universe every day, and by 41 other people who had been reduced to a compliance data point and had become, through patience and attention and the specific human stubbornness of people who know what they are, something else entirely. He climbed down from the temple wall. He walked back through the rain. He was not thinking about tomorrow, or the VETH's response, or the global picture of what the resistance networks might or might not accomplish. He was thinking about tea and the specific sound of rain on a brewery roof, and whether Ogawa's respiratory infection was clearing up. He was thinking about Ito's nod. He was thinking like someone who had somewhere to be. There is a thing that the VETH did not account for, and it is not bravery, though there was bravery, or adaptability, though there was that too. The thing they did not account for was smaller and more durable than either of those. It was the specific human capacity to be, fully and without apology, exactly where you are. To let the moment find you with your hands open. To fall down and get up and receive the small nod and continue. The Veth had been traveling 1,000 years. They had subdued a dozen worlds. They were patient in the way of things whose scale of time made patience trivial. They had reduced humanity to data, and were waiting for the data to resolve into compliance. They had not accounted for the fact that humans, given enough time in enough back rooms, with enough tea and enough rain, would stop performing compliance and start performing something that had no name in any alien taxonomy. Something that had more to do with the way a brewery owner moved through her own establishment than with any military doctrine. Something that was less a strategy than exposition, less a weapon than a way of being present. The Veth would notice the interference. They would notice the gaps in their data. They would, eventually, understand that something had been done that they had not thought to watch for. When they did, there would be a reckoning of a kind that 42 people in a sake brewery were not equipped to predict or prevent. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, the rain continued. The city was asleep. The tea was hot. Somewhere in the city, a schoolteacher was recovering from an infection and had sent a message saying she was sorry to miss it. And somewhere above the harbor, the Veth's main vessel pulsed with the slow rhythms of beings who had not yet understood that the world below them was no longer the world they had mapped. Marcus Cole walked back through the streets of a city that was still occupied and already, in the way of cities that have learned to hold their own, something else. He was thinking about what Ito had said at the end of the very first session, when Marcus had caught him in the redirect and stood there surprised by his own body's knowledge. Ito had looked at him and said, "Now you know what you can do. Not what you have done, not what you will do, what you can do. The knowledge that lives in you regardless of the circumstances that surround it. The thing that cannot be surrendered, because it is not a weapon, and is not a formation, and is not anything the Veth's instruments were built to find." He had not known what to do with that at the time. He was beginning to now. He walked home through the rain. He thought about nothing in particular. He arrived. The tea was still warm. Sadasan had left the lamp on. He sat down and the argument continued.